All right. Third time's the charm. As I was saying, this is the pericope. This is the reading that everybody loves, right? Carolyn's like, you don't like the love your neighbor piece? You like what? You like the love your neighbor? Not like you don't like the love your enemy? I'm going to change it up a little bit today. We're going to read it from the margins and not from our Eurocentric perspective. How's that? And you'll love it even less. If you recall, 2 weeks ago when I preached about the impatience for change and did a little bit of differentiating between what is impatient for change and what is desperate for change. So I'm going to do a little review. When we are impatient for change, we can always step back and take a break, can't we? If it gets too hard, if we get too tired, primarily because our life does not depend on the immediate change. Now, I want to have a little caveat here when we're talking about climate change. Our lives depend on that. But for the sake of argument today, because we cannot see it right in front of us all the time, I'm gonna err on the side of our denial and just put it over here for a few minutes. But the bottom line is if our life is not at risk and remains the same, then we don't necessarily have to move into a space where we can be more than just impatient. If one is desperate for change, it's usually because a life is at risk, if not the life of a whole lot of people. And it may be a life that is demonstrated by a physical life, in other words, having a target on your back, but it can also be a mental, a physical, a spiritual life is at risk. I might be getting ahead of myself, but I needed to just lay that groundwork for us. Love your enemies. I think before we talk about what love is and loving your enemies, we have to talk about what love isn't. Years ago, Elie Wiesel, who survived the Holocaust camps, defined the greatest human sin as being that of indifference. And likewise, many folks will identify the opposite of love as not being hate, but being ambivalence, which is a very close cousin to indifference. Now, we have different kinds of indifferences, right? We have a passive indifference, which allows us to ignore the injustices of what is happening. We have passive indifference, which allows us to ignore injustices that are going around us or what is directed at a particular group of persons. This becomes a silent complicity, right? Because it allows violence to continue without our action. And our lack of action, our inaction is actually action, but it is a passive indifference. We are not necessarily going over and bopping somebody on the head. Active indifference is where violence is perpetrated upon others, but without any apparent emotion or through hatefulness. This is the indifference that is tangible. It is an expression that the perpetrators have no regard for the humanity of the victim. And we see this going back to Wiesel and the Holocaust, where there was just this sort of random killing without any apparent sense of remorse or conscience, or even recognizing the humanity of those who were being murdered. We see it in the context of the history of slavery in this country. We see it when we lock children in cages. We see it with Jesus and the people of his time. To be clear, the outcome is the same. Whether we are passive and do nothing or active and actively perpetrate, the outcome is the same. The injustice and the violence continue. Just want to do a little sidebar here. We use the word injustice a lot in this congregation. And I want you to start hearing when I say injustice, I want you to hear the word violence. Because all injustice is violent. All injustice is violent. So now we have to take a look. We took a look at what love isn't. Love isn't indifferent. Love doesn't view another human being or another part of creation as less than or unworthy. There is no hierarchy of human worth when you are talking about loving another. Now let's take a look at what an enemy is. I'm sure you all have one or two. And it can be a personal enemy. It can be somebody that has hurt us, right? It can be somebody in our family who has let us down, or perhaps we have just been excluded from the family altogether. It can be someone, a coworker who has betrayed you, an ex that always seems to take number one in the category. But an enemy is someone who has hurt us, right? And so when you hear love your enemy, I have no doubt that somebody runs through your head. Really? Nobody's going to raise their hand? Nobody at all? Okay. Now, kids can have enemies at school that can be very hurtful and can be very dangerous. Certainly, those who bully are hurting a child in a number of ways. And we've seen an increase in mental health and suicide reactions to bullying. So I don't want to minimize that. But it is not systemic. It is situational. And most of our enemies are situational. Either we get to ignore them, or we get to move away from them, or we get to write them out of our life, or they write us out of their lives. If the enemy has less to do with another person and has to do with economics, a job, our own self-understanding of ourselves, then we have created another sort of mental or psychic enemy, right? But again, not systemic. For Jesus, in this reading, the enemy was real. The empire killed randomly, without hesitancy, anyone they wanted, and for whatever reason. They killed with impunity, without having to explain why or to really answer to anyone, especially if they were citizens of Rome. The fear this instilled was soul and psychic murder. To live in a constant fear of poverty, hunger, real violence sanctioned by the state was to live in a fear that was in their bones. We hear about crucifixion when it comes to Jesus during Lent and Holy Week, but crucifixion was used regularly, if for no other reason than to pass on a message: stay in your place. Howard Thurman, who is a beautiful, spiritual, and mystical theologian of the 20th century, the ever-present fear that besets the poor, the economically and socially insecure, is a fear of a different breed. It is nowhere in particular, yet it is everywhere. It is a mood which one carries along with themselves, distilled from the acrid conflict with which one's days are surrounded. It has deep roots in the heart of the relations between the weak and the strong, between the controllers of the environment and those who are controlled by it. I do not think there are too many people in here who would identify such an enemy. Are there? When the enemy lives in the air that you breathe and in the water that you drink, it is hard to escape from that enemy. Those of us primarily of European descent or in various levels of a privileged spectrum don't necessarily know what that feels like. We can see when that injustice is perpetrated upon others, then we remain impatient for change because we don't want to see it and we know it's not right. But it is not in our air necessarily, or in our water to the extent that it permeates through our bones. When we look at the horror of the Holocaust from so many years away, there is no doubt that we look at that and we say that those who were passively indifferent were just as culpable as those who were actively indifferent. That those who stood by and watched were just as responsible and complicit in the murder of millions. I have no doubt that in the midst of those people, there were many who were impatient for change. But perhaps they would do better by keeping quiet so as not to bring attention to themselves, quietly praying and hoping that God would intercede. Perhaps they even became a little active as they hid people in their attics, but not so much that they drew attention to the fact that they found the empire to be horrible. And so those who stand in the circle, on the surrounding edges of the circle, and look into the horror and hope that it changes and are impatient for change, those people are enemies to those who are being oppressed. Let me say that again. When we stand on the edges and hope that change comes for those who are oppressed, and just stand there and hope and be patient, we are the enemies of those who are oppressed. Jesus is preaching to those who are oppressed when he is saying, love your enemies. I'm sure that there are some on the side who are Pharisees and Sadducees who are benefiting from being in cahoots with Rome, but probably stand in that middle place of, but these are my people and they're being oppressed, but if I say anything, I will lose my stature. So I will pray that God does something to intervene, while Jesus preaches hope to the oppressed. Those people are enemies of those who are oppressed. In both cases, there are people who hope that things get better. Some did nothing. Some did some. But most of the time, we stood aside and watched without necessarily engaging in what was happening. We were patient for change, but we were not desperate for change. The quote that I read you from Howard Thurman could be applied to Rome and could be applied to Germany. He also wrote that when the basis of such a fear, the fear that those whose neck is being knelt upon by the state, when that fear is analyzed, it's clear that it arises out of a sense of isolation and helplessness in the face of various dimensions of violence to which the underprivileged are exposed. Jesus is preaching to those who have the state kneeling on their necks when he's telling them, love your enemy. He says about the state, whether it's first century Palestine, Germany, and for the sake of our racial justice journey, the United States, when the power and the tools of violence are on one side, the fact that there is no available and recognized protection from violence makes the resulting fear deeply terrifying. Any slight conflict, any alleged insult, any vague whim, and unrelated frustration may bring down upon the head of the defenseless the full weight of naked physical violence. Now, are we talking about first century Palestine? Are we talking about Nazi Germany? Or are we talking about Colorado Springs? In such violence, the contemptuous disregard for personhood is the face that is degrading. Few things more devastating than to have it burned into you that you do not count, that no provisions are made for the literal protection of your person. The underprivileged, I would use the word oppressed, but his quote is, the underprivileged in any society are the victims of a perpetual war of nerves. The logic of the state of affairs is physical violence, but it need not be fulfilled in order to work its perfect havoc in the souls of the poor. When we're hearing this reading and we're hearing love your enemies, we are taking it from that perspective of our social location, and we are thinking of all those people in our minds who are our enemies, yes? But do we ever stop and say, we are the enemy? Because if we were to put ourselves in our particular location here and now into the world of Jesus, he's not talking to us. He's talking about us. We are the enemy. Because whether we are passive or active in our indifference and in our impatience, we are complicit in the oppression of the oppressed. Holy, fill in the blank. It's quite an indictment, isn't it? Jesus is telling those to whom he is preaching to love us. I want to be very clear, because now we're going to define what love is in this context. There's a bunch of covert stuff that's going on that requires a whole other sermon. I won't do it to you today. To turn the other cheek and to give up your cloak was very covert. If someone was struck on the cheek, it was against the law to strike them again. And if a soldier or someone asked, a citizen asked for your coat, they were not allowed to ask you also for your shirt. They could get that next time, but in that moment they couldn't. So when Jesus says, give it to them anyway, it's very covert. It's like, you are not going to break me. You want to hit me? Go ahead, hit me again. Okay. You want my shirt? You can have my coat and my shirt. It was covert. You will not break my spirit is what that was. Along the same lines, when Jesus is saying, love your enemies, it is not about some type of martyrdom. It is not some sort of, well, let's just love so that later on you get yours in heaven. It was, do not become like them in their ambivalence and their indifference and their hatred for you by taking on that mantle. They've taken everything else. Don't give them you. Love like your God loves. Forgive like your God forgives, so that you are not robbed of the one thing that they can never have, which is your spirit, your memory, your heart, your soul. Viktor Frankl also survived the camps, wrote a book, Man's Search for Meaning, in which he said, in the midst of his despair and hopelessness, after he knows that all of his family has been annihilated and has no clue as to how it's going to end for him, he has a realization that in the midst of everything else that has been taken from him, they can't take him. They can't take his memory. They can't take his love for his beloved. They can't take his relationship with the divine. They can have everything else. This is the same thing that Jesus is preaching. Love them so you don't become them. It's a different take. But I believe that that's what was being preached. Now, we are Protestants, and we have to have hope somewhere, Claire, please. Here's where the hope lies. The hope lies in immersing yourself in the oppression. Immersing yourself in the oppression. Having a relationship with the injustice. Taking it on as if it were yours. You may ask yourself, I'm a white, middle class, straight person. How do I do that? Well, I have an answer for you. We need to do whatever we can to relinquish our enemy status. We have to figure out a way to always be in it, not just when it's convenient. We're back to love, aren't we? Now it's about us. How do we love? Well, we take off the mantle of indifference and ambivalence, first and foremost. For those of us who do not walk around with targets on our backs, we must first commit to never be indifferent, ever. And this isn't a one-time commitment, because we commit and then we'll go back and then we'll commit and then we'll go back and then we'll commit and then we'll go back. Second, in our world, both local and global and up here, there must never be a hierarchy of human value. When we start recognizing that we are putting value on one life over the other, for example, do the homeless get to spend their time in the city like everybody else, or do they get pushed to the edges? Once we begin to recognize that we are establishing a hierarchy of human value, then we need to go back and recommit. Finally, but not finally, we must always be vigilant of the injustices around us. Always. We must be vigilant of the attitudes within us. And we must be vigilant of the actions of others and ourselves that allow these injustices to continue. Listen, we And I realize it's a global we, and we all come from different experiences. But we can never completely understand what those who have been oppressed in various places feel, experience, live, hold, carry, pass on. But at least we can immerse ourselves in the story and the reality of the injustice, even as our own discomfort, which will never kill us, by the way. Our discomfort will never kill us. They threaten to swallow us, will never kill us. We need to embrace and become one with the injustice for salvation's sake. Not the salvation of those who are oppressed only, but our own salvation is tied into how we become enmeshed and immersed in the injustice. If we are not working towards justice, our own salvation is at risk. And we must do it with the kind of love that decries indifference and instead recognizes the worth of all humanity and of all creation. Homework. Here's what's going to happen in this church during Lent. Because as we sit here and wonder how we are going to become immersed, how are we going to decry injustice? How are we going to rid ourselves of indifference? We have to have a relationship with the injustice. And so we have purchased a book for every person in this church. And you could be new here. You walked in the door, you get the book. Not today, it's not here. But next time, we are going to do an all-church read of The Cross and the Lynching Tree by Cone. It is going to shake your foundation, rock your world, and heal you until all you feel like is a walking nerve ending. In that reading, you will not be able to be indifferent. In that reading, you will not stand ambivalence. In that reading for that time, you will be as close as you can be to the oppression. You will read it, we will preach on it, we will have a retreat the beginning of Holy Week on the 9th, put it on your calendar, and we will use it as a study throughout Lent and throughout Holy Week. You are here. You show up after listening to me for all these years, and I have no doubt that we can do this. We can remove ourselves from the enemy list and get closer to what it means to be in true allyship with those who need us to be, in order for change to happen, in order for us to feel the desperation for change. Ready? This is where you give up. No, you're not. And that's okay, because we're doing it together. And the people say,